participation in today's event that we organized together with our colleagues from China. I would like to show you, first of all, one iconic photo, which was taken almost 20 years ago. Here we can see the then Secretary of State Colin Powell showing to the Council a test tube with unknown substance to illustrate claims about the alleged threat of biotoxins of Iraqi origin. This photo entailed very grave consequences. As a part of our today's exercise, I invite you to do to take some time to travel back to 2003. On February 2003, this council convened a meeting to discuss the implementation of Resolution 1441. That day, the US Secretary of State was very eloquent in describing the horrifying crimes of Iraqi regime and its alleged continued violation of non-proliferation obligations. He insisted that Baghdad broke every single rule, accumulating stockpiles of chemical and bioweapons, as well as pursuing a nuclear bomb. These conclusions, Mr. Powell argued, were built on solid evidence and constitute, I quote, irrefutable and undeniable proof that Iraq was in further material breach of Resolution 1441. He referred to thick intelligence files with a record of Iraqi non-compliance. It is really fascinating that if you look through the transcript of Mr. Powell's speech, you will see almost the same wording that our colleagues, some of our colleagues, are using today when they talk about Syria. I quote again, Iraq's behavior demonstrates that its regime has made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Regime is concealing its efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. By its failure to seize one last opportunity to come clean and disarm, Iraq has put itself in deeper material breach and closer to the day when it will face serious consequences for its continued defiance of this council. And lastly, we must not shrink from whatever lies ahead of us. We must not shrink from our duty to the citizens of our countries. End of quote. I hope that there is no need to tell you that everyone, that even those who were directly involved in the setup have subsequently acknowledged that there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the thing Colin Powell is holding in this photo is a deliberate fake. I'm taking this time for a reason. These recollections of the past bring about a bitter déjà vu feeling. Just like 20 years ago, today our Western colleagues invest every effort to convince the world that Assad's regime is to be blamed for all deadly sins, including non-proliferation. In doing so, they deliberately neglect all the arguments that contradict the guilty case that they are making. They turn a blind eye not only to our criticism, but also to basic laws of nature, physics, mathematics, and even common sense. They attempt to mobilize public opinion against Syrian authorities with a sole purpose, and it is not about upholding non-proliferation regime. It is all about regime change. So here comes the question, given the record of the past, are there any grounds to believe that in 20 years we will not finally learn that what our Western colleagues are claiming today was just a pack of lies? We are tempted to draw parallels in how such regime change campaigns have been orchestrated. In 2003, it was doctored tapes, fake test tubes, shaky evidence from undisclosed human resources, blurred satellite images. Today, with the advance of technology, we have staged videos of white helmets and other notorious actors have been major contributors to the OPCW, and other notorious actors been major contributors to the OPCW inspectors, shady open sources, testimonies with fake eyewitnesses, doctored reports of fact-finding mission on Duma, censored opinions of inconvenient OPCW staff members, and on top of it, punitive actions against them on behalf of technical secretariat leadership. This most recent development is that a reputable mass media such as BBC have engaged in a shameful crusade against those who simply want to reveal the truth. Maybe having in mind the picture that I'm holding right now. We do not intend to focus today's discussion on what happened in Iraq after 2003. It is part of history now. We all have drawn our own conclusions from that. We reference Iraq today only in the context of perpetual trend to use groundless accusations to put pressure on developing nations. It is exactly that our Western colleagues now pursue with regard to Syria. Their consistent efforts have brought us to an important watershed. Draft decision for the OPCW state parties to suspend Syria's rights on the basis of what I have just mentioned. They intend to table this document in The Hague at the Conference of the State Parties, which is to take place on April 2022. To be more sure, Western delegations are now promoting, as you will see in their statements today, a fresh report of the illegitimate investigation and identification team on alleged use of chemical weapons by Syria in Sarakib, which is just as genuine as the substance in Colin Powell's test tube. Shall we all fall into this trap again, to regret it in 20 years? Today, we have a unique opportunity to hear the views of those who have extensive knowledge on the flaws of decision-making that led to hasty actions, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. Our distinguished briefers today include Hans von Sponeck, former UN Assistant Secretary General and UN Humanitarian Coordinator Iraq. We are honored to have here today US Army Colonel, retired, Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff of United States Secretary of State Colin Powell, now visiting professor at William and Mary College. And we're also glad to greet Aaron Mate, a well-known independent journalist, producer and presenter for The Grey Zone, contributor to The Nation magazine. He already participated in our similar event in September 2020, devoted to revealing the truth about flawed OPCW investigations of alleged use of chemical weapons by Syrian government in Khan Sheikhoun in 2017 and Duma in 2018. We hope that our briefers will help all of us to broaden our outlook, including on the Syrian chemical dossier, to make sure the mistakes of the past are not replicated either in Syria or elsewhere. So without further ado, I will give the floor now to our distinguished guests. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Hans von Sponeck.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I hope you will forgive me if I do refer for a moment to the past. The last time I spoke in the Security Council was 21 years ago, when I outlined the dangers of disinformation and the impact this had for the security and livelihoods of the Iraqi people. I failed to make a difference. We all know what happened in Iraq and why it happened. It was then when I first interacted in Baghdad with a highly professional OPCW delegation, which had come at the request of the Secretary General Kofi Annan to close a UN disarmament laboratory under more than dubious circumstances. I appreciate the opportunity to participate today in this Arria Formula meeting on the unresolved Duma chemical weapons controversy. I want to assure you that I join this meeting with respect, with great respect for an organization to which I belonged 32 years and which I value deeply. I understand that you are representing governments while I represent only myself. There have been already a good number of Arria meetings on Duma. It would be most unfortunate if a Duma fatigue sets in, since this most serious controversy has yet to be resolved through a unity of purpose consistent with the principles, and may I, Ambassador, add the ethics of the United Nations Charter. The Duma debate is different from other UN debates, where year after year, a majority of member states adopts recommendations without being able to solve the issue. The controversy on the alleged use of chemical weapons in Duma has to do with the seemingly irreconcilable contradictions between denial and acknowledgement of facts, and the immediate impact this has on the security in the Middle East and elsewhere. Concerning the details and timelines for Duma, I would ask that you bear with me when I very briefly summarize what has become a reliable public platform of facts of international concern. The serious incident in Duma in April 2018 was followed by airstrikes involving 3 P5 members without, important to me as a former UN official, without Security Council consent. The strikes were justified as punitive measures for the alleged use by the Syrian Arab Republic of chemical weapons in Duma. A year later, a fact-finding mission report was published by OPCW providing exposed the allegation that chemical weapons had been used in Duma. The report did not reflect that, according to senior inspectors, there had been serious procedural irregularities and scientific flaws on how the investigation had arrived at its conclusions. Preceding the final report, an interim report became available in June 2018. The original draft referred to uncertainty about the use of chlorine agents. The redacted version, the manipulated version, however, indicated that reactive chlorine was present. We are told that some 50 civilians died in Duma, and yet the causes of their deaths remain unexplained. Going forward, these deaths must eventually be investigated as a potential war crime. The manner in which this serious controversy has been handled by OPCW management reflects the long-standing and systematic campaign that has sought to cover up any serious questioning of the OPCW through stonewalling and unacceptable smear tactics. Director General Arias is correct, I repeat, is correct in referring to the politicization of the chemical weapon debate, as he did yesterday at the EU Parliamentary Subcommittee on Security and Defense, pointing the finger at capitals of UN member states as the parties that have the responsibility to resolve this crisis. I do agree. It, however, does not dispense a Director General from his duties as a responsible manager of an important multilateral institution. At yesterday's EU hearings, which I viewed, he regrettably failed to answer precise and direct questions raised by members of the European Parliament regarding the Duma investigation. More generally, Ambassador and colleagues and members of the UN, senior OPCW management has refused repeated requests by dissenting inspectors to meet and review the Duma file. OPCW also ignored to respond to inquiries by outsiders, including members of parliament. A statement of concern was signed in March by 28 internationally known and respected men and women, including OPCW scientists, coming from very different backgrounds. They had one thing in common: the demand for a transparent, independent, and accountable OPCW. The statement of concern was received by Director General Arias, but returned to the sender, without comments. An unfortunate act, in my view, of humiliation for the 28 professionals who signed the agreement. I assume that the statement has also reached you, as it was sent to all 193 OPCW state parties, the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Let me interject here with some uneasiness, Ambassador. I have decided willingly to join those who want to defend the integrity of scientific research, the credibility of OPCW as an important global institution, and more specifically, to help in the protection of the right of dissent. To put it crudely to you, I'm nobody's useful idiot here. The Security Council cannot be surprised that there is an increasing public pressure, people pressure. We the peoples, remember the opening of the UN Charter, for UN leadership to find an unbiased resolution of this troubling controversy. In this spirit, I would ask for no more, but also for no less, that you accept what I have today as a voice of an outsider. Duma is, of course, about the protection of scientific evidence, but Duma is only part of a much bigger geopolitical confrontation. It is about honesty and the grave danger of politicization of facts. It's about preventing unfortunate precedents from replication. It's about the protection of individuals, revealing the truth. Nations and people alike must be protected from unsubstantiated claims. This demand is what motivates an increasing number of people in all parts of the world to prevail in making the case for truth about Duma. As a first step of redress and the healing of an institution, I would hope that statesmanship prevails in accepting facts and ending the defense of what has become indefendable. And that as members of the Security Council, especially the P5, your governments will use their collective influence next week at the forthcoming Conference of State Parties in The Hague to request OPCW's Director General Arias to provide a neutral forum For example, the OPCW Scientific Advisory Board, or alternatively, an independent commission in which the concerns of all the OPCW investigators can be heard. A review, Ambassador, behind closed doors and without media, with results made public when a fully objective and scientific investigation of the Duma attack of 2018 has become available. Thank you.
I think Mr. von Sponeck. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Lawrence Wilkerson. And before I give the floor, I would request everyone who are not speaking to see to their mics that they are switched off, so that we don't have echo. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all of you for allowing me to appear before this Arria Formula meeting. My bona fides, if you will, in this matter are general, and that's the perspective from which I'd like to speak. I served for 4 years as the assistant to the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, roughly from 1989 to 1993. And then again, I served as his chief of staff and associate director of his policy planning staff when he was Secretary of State, roughly 2000 and 2005. So that's the experience level I have at the, if you will, in the highest corridors of power in Washington in the United States government. With that as a backdrop, let me say also that I know that the state capitals in the world, particularly Moscow, Beijing, Washington, Delhi, and others, use their influence whenever they can and whenever they feel it necessary to pressure international organizations. And I know that leading the pack in that regard is my country. I was there when we went around the world, for example, negotiating bilateral Article 98 agreements with every country we could get into in order to subvert the ICC and to make sure that no US troops operating in anyone's country could ever be prosecuted by the ICC. I was there when we brought undue pressure on the UN inspectors going into Iraq, not just once, but 2 or 3 times. I was there when Colin Powell gave that presentation at the United Nations. Indeed, I helped him to give it. I was there when we brought undue pressure on other international organizations to more or less influence them to make decisions that were in line with our policy preferences and in line with our security preferences. Every state capital in the world of consequence at one time or another has probably done that. I know Beijing, Moscow, Washington do it all the time. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. And here's the second part of my perspective. This OPCW business really needs to get settled. We're never going to have a perfect set of international organizations because of what I just described, but we can do better. And when we make mistakes, tragic mistakes, which I think this is a case of, we need to try and correct them. And I applaud you for having this meeting and other things that are going on peripheral to it and ancillary to it that are trying to do this, and all the people who are participating and trying to do it. Because here we have an egregious situation that from everything I can see really calls on people of concern to straighten it out. And I like what Hans just said about doing that, an independent commission and so forth. At the same time, I realize too that it's difficult to do this sort of thing and to, in a sense, in a phrase, get away with it, because the capitals I just enumerated and others will be trying to keep you from doing it. There's no question in my mind that Bashar al-Assad has done some evil things. There's no question in my mind that Saddam Hussein did a lot of evil things. There's no question in my mind that Washington has done a lot of evil things, and Moscow and Beijing too. But here is a specific incident where we are undermining one of those organizations designed by all of us, I hope, to keep that from getting out of hand, to keep things on an even keel, if you will, to make sure people are in fact held responsible for deeds that they do, whether they are purported as such in the media or not. The real facts. I've not been on the ground in Duma, but I've seen just hordes of photographs about the situation in Syria and about alleged chemical weapons use. And frankly, as a military professional, on each occasion, I was appalled. I was appalled at the media and the way they reported it. I was appalled at the sensation created around it and so forth. I knew that the United States Army, my army, had spent time in the Mediterranean destroying, I think it was 600 metric tons of chemical weapons from Syria. Did Bashar al-Assad put some aside? Possibly. But I know from my own authorities that they thought that was, in conjunction with the Russians, that was a pretty thorough cleansing of chemical weapons in Syria. So my antenna were up acutely right away when someone claims that there was chemical weapons used in Syria and that it was the government of Syria that did it. And then when I saw the photographs and other things, I know a little bit about VX and sarin and chlorine and so forth. I saw that some of the claims were preposterous. They were preposterous, simply preposterous. When you see a man standing beside a crater, for example, and alleged VX or sarin was used, you know it's preposterous. The man would be dead. I know how effective these kinds of chemical weapons are. And I happen to know also what kinds of weapons Syria had in its stockpile. We had a dossier on that for a long, long time during the Cold War. So count me very skeptical on even any use of chemical weapons of consequence by the Syrian government in Syria. That's the start point. And then this occasion in April just seems to me to be a reflection of that, plus an attempt to subvert an otherwise pretty sound organization, the OPCW. I know how we tried to influence the IAEA with regard to Iraq and other countries. I know how, as I said before, we tried to undermine the ICC, we being Washington. So I'm here as an impartial observer, if you will, but my real interest is in, as I think most of your interest is probably in, is keeping this international organization sound. The OPCW is a very important organization. It represents one of the few more heinous utensils of warfare, if you will, that we have largely gotten rid of, and I would like to see totally eradicated from the face of the earth. And I'm a military professional telling you that. There is no good to be had out of chemical weapons, period. Over. Conversation ended. So we need to make sure this organization has the power and the backing and the support to do its job and to make sure that we fulfill these promises that nation states make about not having these heinous weapons. So that's my perspective on it. That's why I'm here. And I'd be glad to answer questions regarding that perspective if we have some later on. And thank you for having me again.
I thank Mr. Wilkerson. And now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Aaron Mate.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here once again. I really appreciate the opportunity. So it has been 3 years since the alleged chemical attack in Duma, and nearly 2 years since the cover-up of the OPCW investigation into Duma was exposed. But yet, all this time later, nothing has been done to address the serious flaws in this investigation. So what I want to do today is go through some of the few arguments that have been made by the OPCW and other state parties in trying to justify why they refuse to meet with the inspectors, the original inspectors who challenged the cover-up of their probe, and why they refuse to investigate any of the scientific fraud that was alleged. So again, what are the basic details of this incident? April 7th, 2018, something horrible happens in Duma. Dead bodies are filmed inside of a building. The US, Britain, and France, a few days later, bomb Syria, accusing it of committing a chemical attack in Duma. Shortly after that, the OPCW gets a team on the ground, for the first time actually having a fact-finding mission, reaching the site of an alleged chemical attack in Syria. They investigate. About a year later, in March 2019, a final report comes out. And that report claims that there are reasonable grounds to believe that a chlorine attack occurred in Duma. And the inference of the report is that Syria was guilty. So it aligns with the narrative put out by the countries that bombed Syria. But then we get a pretty extraordinary series of leaks that exposes a major deception. And these leaks show that the actual inspectors who went to Duma did not reach the conclusion that was put out by the OPCW. And they actually found that there was no evidence of a chemical attack in Duma. They did not speculate as to what actually happened, but what they said is that there was no evidence of a chemical attack. We saw that because one of the leaks we got was the original report from the Duma team. They wrote a report that was never released to the public until it was leaked. That report was peer-reviewed by the team. It was set for publication, but then something very strange happened. The author of that original report, the chief author, who's been identified by the OPCW as Inspector B, he discovered that someone above him had actually been trying to rush out a bogus report, taking the original report, removing all the key scientific findings, and adding unsupported conclusions, including speculating that chlorine gas was likely used and falsely claiming that there were high concentrations of that chemical. So Inspector B thwarted the publication of this bogus report because he sent an email of protest that was sent out to all the Duma team members and some officials. That led to the publication of the interim report in early July 2018. The interim report removed the bogus claims of the doctored bogus report, but it also removed some of the key claims of the original report. So it was sort of a compromise. And around that time, something else very curious happened. A US delegation visited the Duma team and tried to lobby them into reaching the conclusion that there was a chlorine attack. Now, it's very common, as we know, for state parties to share information, share views, share intelligence, but a one-on-one briefing in which the inspectors who are supposed to be protected comes face to face with a US delegation is very unusual. The first director general of the OPCW, Jose Bustani, told me at the Gray Zone that he would never have allowed such a meeting to take place. Something else happens around then too. The original team, including Inspector B, who was the chief author of the original report, they are all sidelined. They're taken off the Duma investigation and they're replaced by a so-called core team. And this is comprised mostly of people who never set foot in Syria. And that is the team that produced the final report. So then we get these leaks showing all this happening. And then what happens? Well, the OPCW refuses to meet with the inspectors. They refuse to investigate the doctoring of the original report. When Jose Bustani, the first director general of the OPCW, when he tries to speak at the UN Security Council, when he was invited, certain member states block him from speaking. And what's interesting about that is Jose Bustani, being the first director general, helped design the protocols used for inspection missions like Duma. He also worked with the key dissenting inspectors because these two inspectors, they're so experienced at the OPCW that their tenure coincides with the organization's first leader. And also he has experience in what we're talking about today, which is that putting pressure on the OPCW, because when he was the chief, he was forced out by the US because he was standing in the way of the Iraq war. He was trying to bring Iraq into the Chemical Weapons Convention, and he was even physically threatened, as he's talked about publicly. And meanwhile, also, some deceptive claims are put out in the media about the inspectors. They are disseminated through state-funded outlets, including the BBC, funded by the UK, and also a website called Bellingcat, which is funded by the US, making false claims about the inspectors and the investigation. So that's what the OPCW's response has been to these allegations. In terms of what they actually say about why they want to address the fraud, they've said very little. But so today I want to address what little they have said, and that is this claim. So the Director General has dismissed the inspector's concerns because he argues that they, quote, had no involvement in the last 6 months of the fact-finding mission investigation when most of the analytical work took place. So the first part of the sentence is true. They were not involved in the last 6 months. That's because Inspector A was sidelined along with the other members of the original team. And Inspector B, his tenure ended in September of 2018, so he was out of the organization. The second, though, part of this sentence is false. And that's when the Director General says that in the last 6 months, most of the analytical work took place. I want to show you today why that is false. And to glean that, we can learn the facts by comparing the reports. So there's 4 reports. There's the original report of June 2018. There's the redacted bogus report of June 2018. That's the one where unknown officials tried to replace the original report. There's the interim report that was put out in July 2018, and the final report put out in March 2019. So we compare all of those. The key fact here is that the bulk of the investigation was not conducted in the last 6 months. If you compare the reports, you will see that the bulk of the investigation was completed within the first 2 months of the post-deployment investigation, when one of the dissenting inspectors, Inspector B, was still the key figure in overseeing the scientific element of the investigation and authoring the report. So the timeline we're comparing here is the first 2 months after the team gets back from Syria, that's early May, the 2 months after that. And then the last 6 months when the OPCW Director General claims that the bulk of the analytical work was conducted. So first, what do these stats show us? They show us that when it comes to the chemical analysis, these are the samples analyzed by the designated laboratories. 70% of the total samples analyzed were analyzed in the first month of the investigation. When it comes to the wood samples analyzed, and this is key because in the attempts to attack the inspectors, there have been false claims made about the wood samples, showing that these wood samples somehow proved the ultimate conclusion. The wood samples, 100% of those wood samples were analyzed in the first month of the investigation. Same thing with biological samples. Interviews, 87% of the interviews conducted and analyzed, these are the witnesses in Syria and also in country X, 87% are conducted and analyzed before the interim report is issued in July 2018. Toxicology, so you have consultation with toxicologists, and there's a few meetings. The original one comes in June 2018. Another meeting comes in September and October of 2018, and we'll revisit the significance of this shortly. Engineering studies on the cylinder. So this is looking at the 2 gas cylinders that were found at location 2 and location 4. In the original report, a large body of qualitative work was done on the chlorine cylinders. In the final report, 3 external experts were engaged to conduct modeling studies on the cylinders. Their findings are cited in the report, but we only see a few small extracts. So independent judgment of their work has so far been impossible. Now, there was another study done by Inspector A, who was a member of the original Duma team. He carried this out, also engaging with external experts, but his report was rejected from inclusion in the final report. Analyzing the metadata. So this is analyzing the information contained in photos and videos. 98.5% of that takes place by June 20th, 2018. The drafting of the report. So comparing the original report by the original team with the final report, I haven't done the exact science, but if you look yourself and compare, most of the original report is contained in the final report. It's just that the key scientific findings that include exculpatory evidence are omitted. Scientific research, so comparing the bibliographies, 100% of the scientific articles that were cited in the final report were already cited by June 20th, 2018. So basically, no new scientific research is conducted. So those are the stats. What is the significance of all this? What can we learn about the work that was done after the interim report in July 2018? On the chemical side, only 4 new samples analyzed from location 2 after the interim report was issued. Location 2 is where the dead bodies were found. The only chemicals identified in these samples were 1, dichloroacetic acid, which is a chemical found everywhere, such as in the drinking water. And 2, on the chlorine cylinders, there was the element chloride, also very common in the environment. Traces of various other unspecified chemicals known as CLOCs, chlorinated organic compounds, also detected by one of the two designated laboratories. Now, what is the meaning of this? The final report does not argue that the presence of these chemicals provides any evidence for a chlorine gas release, These chemicals can come from many sources other than from exposure to chlorine gas. In fact, the report put out just this week by the OPCW IIT, it states that, quote, explanations other than the use of chlorine as a weapon remain possible for the presence of the chlorinated organic compounds in the samples. Now, there also was a very strange delay in the analysis when you look at the timeline. So looking at the original team in the first 2 months, the first 31 samples, including 11 biological samples, were analyzed by the OPCW's laboratories in under 3 weeks after the return of the inspectors from Syria. Now, to analyze an additional 13 samples, which only included environmental samples, that took a further 8 months. So given the importance of this report, why is there an 8-month delay in analyzing a further 13 samples? Toxicology. So the toxicologists consulted by the fact-finding mission in June 2018 concluded in unequivocal language that the symptoms observed in the deceased victims were inconsistent with exposure to chlorine, and no other obvious candidate chemical causing the symptoms could be identified. This conclusion was suppressed in the final report. And what's interesting is not only was the conclusion suppressed, but even the fact that this meeting occurred was suppressed, because if you look at the timeline that is included of the investigation, for some reason, this June 2018 meeting is excluded. The final report states in passing that the toxicologists were consulted in September and October 2018. So this is the meeting that is included in September 2018. It doesn't mention, though, what these toxicologists found, what the OPCW was told in September and October 2018. In fact, in the final report in evasive language concludes that, quote, it is not currently possible to precisely link the cause of the signs and symptoms to a specific chemical. But this language disingenuously avoids acknowledging that, according to the original toxicologist consulted in June, chlorine was eliminated from the list of possibilities. And the fact that this meeting occurred was also eliminated from the final report's timeline, very oddly. Witness testimonies. The original report sets out witness testimonies along the lines of two clear and distinct narratives that were gleaned from the analysis of the witness statements. You have witnesses interviewed in Syria and witnesses interviewed in country X. One narrative, which is dominant in the accounts from those interviewed in Syria, is that there was no chemical attack and that the injuries treated in the hospital were due to dust and smoke inhalation. The second narrative, dominant in the accounts from those interviewed in country X, is that the witnesses experienced a chemical attack. In the final report, these distinctions, these very clear distinctions, are blurred, and the final conclusions only draw on the witness statements coming from those interviewed in country X. This selective use of evidence is scientifically fraudulent and unethical. It is unclear what, if any, 5 additional interviews conducted after the interim report added to the analysis. Engineering studies, looking at the cylinders. The suppressed original report has extensive qualitative analysis on the 2 chlorine cylinders and the relative damage done to them and the surfaces they allegedly made contact with. In particular, the original report raises serious doubts about how the cylinder at location 4 could have changed trajectory on impacting the bedroom floor and then landing on the bed over 3 meters away. This is because, as the report says, there are no indications that it made contact with any of the walls or window underneath. So this is this improbable situation where you have a cylinder supposedly dropping vertically through a ceiling and then bouncing off the floor and landing on a bed. A further study coordinated by a senior member of the fact-finding mission team, again, that's Inspector A, one of the dissenting inspectors, raised similar concerns, but this study was rejected by senior management for consideration in the final report. The engineering studies that were considered for the final report are superficial with little by way of engineering data or explanations. The most glaring example, I think, is how the inexplicable bouncing of the cylinder onto the bed was glossed over with nothing more than this claim that, quote, after passing through the ceiling and impacting the floor at lower speed, the cylinder continued altered trajectory until reaching the position in which it was found. So bouncing off the floor onto the bed with no visible markings on the walls or the windows. The selective censoring of information. So just to give you an example of how the final report doctored the conclusions of the original report. So this is some material here from the original report. And it's talking about how bodies were filmed at location 2. And it says that the bodies were moved and repositioned between video recordings. So that word there, repositioned, was removed from the final report. So basically, somebody was manipulating the bodies at the scene, repositioning them. That reference was taken out from the final report. Also taken out from the final report is this entire paragraph in yellow here. And it includes this line: the fact-finding mission did not obtain any video footage or photos of dead casualties lying in the basement of location 2 or being removed there. The reason why this is significant is because a number of witnesses claimed that the bodies were in the basement, even though there was no video of that and no video of those bodies being moved. So conclusions: the bulk of the investigative work, particularly the chemical analysis, witness interviews and analysis, photo and metadata analysis, the report writing, and literature research was completed by early June, the first 7 weeks of the investigation, while the dissenting inspector, Inspector B, was still responsible for overseeing the report writing and the scientific work. A large part of the toxicology and engineering studies was already done by the stage as well. No satisfactory explanation has been given for how the minor additional work conducted during the last 6 months of the investigation would alter the findings of the original report that there was no evidence of a chemical attack. And here we should say too, that even if there is additional work being done after the original team is sidelined, if you are not addressing the alleged fraud that occurred, that only raises the possibility that more fraud took place after that. Now, in particular, the new report does not cite any of the additional analysis results, toxicology, and witness testimonies as new evidence. The only additional evidence is the engineering studies. But as we have seen, these engineering studies are called into question by the work done by the original team and the work done by Inspector A that he oversaw. Apart from not finding any meaningful evidence to conclude that there was a chemical attack, key evidence contained in the original report that raised serious doubts about a chlorine attack was expunged with no justification from the final report. That key evidence includes toxicology assessments and inconsistencies in witness statements that should have raised doubts about their reliability. And the fact that all this took place should certainly raise doubts about the reliability of the final report's conclusions. So those are the facts of the work done. Again, instead of addressing this, the OPCW has offered excuses. The most recent one we heard yesterday from the Director General Arria, where he was questioned by, as we heard earlier, by 2 Irish members of Parliament, asked a very simple question: will you meet with the dissenting inspectors? He didn't answer the question. He also said something very interesting. He said, quote, "I don't know why this report about Duma was very much contested," which is interesting because he's previously claimed that the inspectors, quote, "conclusions are erroneous, uninformed, and wrong." He said that in February 2020. So if you don't know why the report was contested, how can you claim that those contesting it were, quote, erroneous, uninformed, and wrong? But the fact is, the Director General does know why this report was contested. If he's managed to ignore all the leaked reports, the statements that have been sent to him, what he has not ignored, we know for sure, is a letter from Inspector B that Arias replied to in June 2019. And that letter from Inspector B laid out all of his concerns in detail. So it's not true when he says he does not know why this report was contested. So finally, I just want to close and say that the victims in Duma deserve justice. On top of protecting the integrity of the OPCW, of international law, of the word of government who claim that we have to bomb countries based on allegations. The victims in Duma deserve justice, and you cannot claim to care about the victims in Duma if you are supporting the censorship of the investigation into their deaths. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mate. Colleagues, I know that there are requests to take the floor before 11 o'clock by a number of delegations. Look, we have other speakers, and in particular the one that is an affected country that I think should speak first in any case. What I suggest that we will give you the floor after the meeting that you're referring to, and you will have a chance to speak. We will not prevent anybody from speaking at this meeting. But now it's already nearly 11 o'clock, so you will not be able to make your statements before it comes. So I suggest that you delay your statements a little bit, and we will provide the floor to you. And now I'd like to give the floor to the ambassador of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank you for the organizing this important meeting, and also to thank the briefers for the valuable information they provided. Mr. Chair, we share the concern about the danger that the non-proliferation regime is facing and the grave challenges resulting from the unprecedented manipulation by the governments of some member states, especially United States. We were all witnesses to these countries' systematic violations of the principles and control of that regime, including by supplying Israelis' occupation with all types of weapons of mass destruction, and at the same time targeting other countries and launching acts of aggressions and military invasions against them under the pretext of possessing or using those weapons. These countries have continued their irresponsible behavior in Syria by repeating the same scenario, covering up the terrorist organization's use of chemical weapons by accusing and defaming the Syrian government and fabricating excuses to keep the so-called Syrian chemical file open, by questioning Syria's cooperation with the OPCW and deliberate disregard of successes achieved so far. In this regard, I would like to emphasize the following point. Syria was among the first to call for making the Middle East a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, and it has always affirmed its condemnations of the use of chemical weapons by anyone at any time and place and under any circumstances. Syria reiterates that it has not used chemical weapons and it no longer possesses any of them, and considers that the use of such weapons to be inconsistent with its moral and legal obligations. Syria voluntarily joined the OPCW and committed itself to cooperate with its technical secretariat to close the file permanently, despite the challenges posed by confronting terrorists, acts of aggressions, unilateral coercive measures, and most recently the COVID-19 pandemic. Syria was a victim of terrorist organizations' repeated use of chemical weapons, starting with Khan al-Assal incidents in 2013 and other subsequent incidents, and a victim of wrongful, unprofessional practices committed by OPCW and its teams, and again, victim of politicizations and pressures exerted by Western countries on the OPCW decision-making bodies through the manipulations of the provisions of the CWC. Mr. Chair, Syria and Russia and other countries have expressed their concerns about many technical aspects. They have been raised today in relation to the wrong methods of work followed by OPCW teams and violations that occurred during their investigations, including by relying on open sources and not visiting the locations of the alleged incidents, not collecting samples and maintaining their chain of custody, and many others. Unfortunately, OPCW has neglected all these concerns, including those expressed by many experts, such as Inspector Jan Henderson, as well as ignoring the statements issued by Courage Foundation, Berlin 21 Group, and Grey Zone websites on behalf of a group of prominent scientists and personalities, led by Jose Bustani, the first Director General of the OPCW. What is reprehensible is that some within OPCW target and discredit these experts and inspectors who express dissenting views and raise concerns that deserve attention. The fact that United States, France, and United Kingdom exerted pressures to establish the so-called Investigations and Identifications Team illegally, covered up its unprofessional practices and wrong methods of work, and then rely on its misleading report to present a draft decision to the Conference of States Parties to the OPCW, are all clear evidence proving that these countries are seeking to target Syria by rendering the so-called IIT into a platform to pass their aggressive policies. The issuance of a second preposterous report by this team at this exact timing, just days before Conference of States Party, is an sufficient proof of those countries' control over the work of the OPCW and its senior management. Such a report is also clear proof of instrumentalizing OPCW to serve the agendas of those countries in mobilizing the largest number of member states to support the draft decision submitted to the aforementioned conference in order to target Syria, tarnish its reputation, and distort its image. This conduct undermines the technical nature of the work of the OPCW and has a serious repercussions on the future of the cooperation with it. The French Western draft decision sets a new and dangerous precedent in the work of the OPCW and is another violation of the provisions of the CWCs, specifically Article 8 and 12 of the Convention. This draft decision promotes false conclusions that aims to create a new pretext for committing more aggressive acts against Syria and encourages terrorist organizations to fabricate more stage incidents in order to accuse Syrian Arab Army and its allies of using chemical weapons. Mr. Chair, Syria categorically rejects all false allegations against it and calls on all responsible states in the international community to expose those fabricated allegations and not to be drawn into this Western endeavor. Syria considers that voting against this draft decision will not only be in favor of Syria, but also in the interest of all states parties defending the principles of the Convention and other international norms. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, upholding the non-proliferation regime and protecting developing countries from pressures require, first, maintaining the technical nature of the OPCW and its commitments to the professional criteria contained in the Convention, and ensuring impartiality and credibility in its work. Second, obtaining accurate and decisive conclusions far from odds and probability, and ensuring their conformity with the legal and professional criteria stipulated in the CWC, because revealing any prohibited use of chemical weapons requires the strongest possible guarantees regarding credibility. Third, the solution to the current dilemma in the OPCW does not lie in ignoring the legitimate concern of states parties and scientists, including those who worked in the OPCW, but rather in listening attentively and making a sincere effort to address these concerns. Fourthly, confronting all practices aimed at politicizing any mechanism with an international character and turning it into a platform to target specific countries under false pretenses. Fifth, adopting serious constructive dialogue and pursuing multilateral diplomacy to address any differences and refrain from the threat of or use of forces against member states. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank Ambassador of Syria, and now I will be giving floor to the members of the Security Council that wanted to take it. But first, I have to give the floor to China as the co-organizer of this meeting. Ambassador, again, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vasily. Thank you for chairing this very important meeting, and also thank the Russian mission for taking the initiative of organizing this Arria Formula event. I listened very attentively to the briefings by the prominent persons and the independent experts, and also the remarks by the permanent representative of Syria. I found them quite instructive, thought-provoking, and helpful. Excellencies, colleagues, as a state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention, China firmly opposes the use of chemical weapons for any purpose by anyone under any circumstance. Stockpiled and abandoned chemical weapons must be destroyed. China supports OPCW to fulfill its mandate in accordance with the CWC. We are concerned that some countries, in violation of the CWC, have weaponized the OPCW and use it as a tool to pressure other countries, in particular developing countries. The establishment of IIT and the adoption of relevant decisions concerning Syria chemical weapon issue are highly controversial. China reiterates that the issue of accountability for the use of chemical weapons must be discussed within the framework of CWC. We call on all state parties to abide by the provisions of the CWC and safeguard the authority and integrity of the OPCW. The practice of politicization should be stopped. All investigation must be conducted in an objective, impartial, and professional manner. And all conclusions must withstand the test of time and truth. There have been many criticisms and concerns around certain FFM and IIT reports on alleged chemical weapons use in Syria. In February, the Courage Foundation issued a statement of concern signed by 20 prominent persons, calling for open response from the OPCW to questions and doubts on the Duma report. These concerns should not be overlooked. The international community must draw a lesson from the war on Iraq in 2003. China objects hasty accusations in the absence of unquestionable evidence and call for more technical discussions in The Hague before any actions be taken. We are against the draft decision to deprive Syria of its rights as a state party in the OPCW. We believe that dialogue and consultation is the only way to resolve the chemical weapon issue in Syria. The Syrian government and the OPCW Technical Secretariat have maintained regular contact and achieved positive results from bilateral consultations. We encourage continued cooperation between the two parties and urge relevant countries to create favorable conditions for such engagement, rather than downplay or undermine it. It's China's consistent position that state parties should bridge differences through dialogue in the OPCW. Vote could only lead to deep divisions among state parties, which is extremely detrimental to international non-proliferation regime. The OPCW should make every effort to strengthen mutual trust among state parties and carry on the tradition of making decisions based on consensus. I thank you, Vasily.
I thank you again. Now I'll be giving the floor to the delegations of the members of the Security Council in the order I received them. If any delegation that requested for the floor is present absent from the room, I will revert to it when it reappears. But I recognize here Ambassador Richard Mills of the United States, and I give the floor to him now.
Thank you, Vasily. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. And I suppose, given what's come before, I should start by stating the obvious. The use of chemical weapons constitutes a threat to peace and security for all states. The United States remains firmly committed to upholding the integrity of international non-proliferation regimes, which is the stated topic of today's meeting. We certainly share this goal, and we certainly call on all members of this council to uphold what is a solemn responsibility to help prevent the scourge of chemical weapons. But I have to also question whether the motivation for today's meeting is genuinely to advance international peace and security, or whether it was in fact called on short notice by Russia as a means to deflect attention from the latest evidence of the crimes that have been committed by the Assad regime. We are not here to give oxygen to Syrian and Russian disinformation, nor to play along as Russia continues to impugn the professionalism, the integrity of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, before this council. In this regard, let me acknowledge the presence of a former colleague, Colonel Wilkerson, who has shared his perspective with us. And I thank Colonel Wilkerson for his service to the US military, to the US government. And I appreciate him sharing his perspective based on events that happened a generation ago. And as he admitted, on his analysis of photos that appeared in media, which he had the opportunity to see as a non-expert. But I think it's very important we focus on current situation and on current facts. And let me begin by saying in that regard, the US wholeheartedly supports the impartial and independent work of the OPCW for the professional manner in which it carries out its mission. We fully concur with the findings of the April 12th report of the OPCW's Investigation and Identification Team, or IIT. That report, composed of experts, determined that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the Assad regime used chlorine as a chemical weapon in Sarakib on February 4th, 2018. We know the IIT's methods were thorough and credible. We know that the IIT attempted to engage with the Syrian government on its investigation, but it was ignored. The Sarakib attack was not a rogue or accidental event. It was not an attack by some other group. This was the Assad regime, once again, causing suffering for its own people. The damning body of evidence from the OPCW and the earlier UN-OPCW joint investigative mechanism makes clear that the Assad regime is responsible for using chemical weapons against Syrian civilians on multiple occasions. Our own assessment is that the Assad regime has in fact used chemical weapons on its own people at least 50 times since the beginning of the conflict. We further assess that the Assad regime retains sufficient chemicals and expertise to use these weapons again. The Assad regime's allies, particularly Russia, have repeatedly sought to block international efforts to hold the regime accountable for its use of chemical weapons and numerous other atrocities. Russia prefers to try to sow confusion instead, to claim that the facts are not the facts, that the crystal clear evidence before us is somehow corrupted. Russia seeks to discredit the integrity and professional work of the OPCW through fatuous and debunked claims. And I'm afraid today's meeting further demonstrates this ongoing willingness to use the platform of respected multilateral institutions to legitimate false claims. Responsible nations share a duty to uphold the Chemical Weapons Convention. The United States, joined by 45 co-sponsors from around the world, submitted a draft decision to the OPCW Conference of the State Parties in response to Syria's failure to comply with its obligations. This decision would be an important step in imposing accountability for Syria's non-compliance. And in this regard, let me say, we've heard a lot today about the Duma report and challenges to its integrity. But I would point out the basis for the draft decision is not the Duma report, it's the attack on Latima. So in a way, we're talking about something that doesn't relate to the key draft decision before the OPCW and states parties. We call upon the Conference of the States Parties to take the necessary and appropriate action when it reconvenes next week to send a strong message to the Assad regime that its behavior must have consequences. Let me close by saying it's time for the Assad regime to stop making excuses. It's time for the regime to instead uphold its obligations under Resolution 2118 and the Chemical Weapons Convention. It is time for the responsible nations of the world to finally consign these barbaric weapons to history. And it is time for this Council and the OPCW to ensure accountability for these crimes. All people, including most of all the Syrian people, deserve to live in a world free of the threat of chemical weapons. Thank you.
I thank you, Richard. I believe that for me as a chair, it is not appropriate to engage in a dialogue. I would reserve the right to sum it up when we finish our meeting today. And now I'll give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom if he is in the room. If not, we will pass it to the next speaker. Do we have UK with us now?
Ambassador, my deputy permanent representative has had to step away. So with your forbearance, if he could be given the floor when he returns, we'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Of course, I'll do like I said, exactly like I said, like you say now.
We're very grateful.
Do we have France with us? I don't see France, but I see. But
thank you very much,
you're here.
Mr. Chairman. No, the same goes with France. So we would kindly ask for you to give him the floor a bit later on. Thank you very much.
Of course, yes, I will. But I recognize the representative of Ireland. Mr. Kelly, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for the invitation to today's meeting. Let me also begin from first principles. Ireland unequivocally condemns any use of chemical weapons and all weapons of mass destruction, anywhere and at any time. We've all seen the devastating and indiscriminate impact these terrible weapons have on people and communities in Syria. We should be united in acting together to uphold the international prohibition against the use of these appalling weapons. We deeply regret that Council has not been able to do this with some focusing instead on seeking to undermine the professionalism and impartiality of the OPCW. Mr. Chair, let me be very clear. Ireland rejects any attempt to undermine the integrity of international non-proliferation regimes, and in particular, the continued attack today on the OPCW. I reiterate our firm confidence in and support for the professionalism, integrity, and impartiality of the OPCW. We, as the international community, have established the OPCW to be the impartial and authoritative voice with the legal mandate and technical expertise to address the problem of chemical weapons. It forms an essential part of the global disarmament and non-proliferation architecture and protects all of our interests, including those of developing countries, in ensuring the global elimination of these weapons. This is why we reject the continued political pressure placed by Russia on the OPCW regarding its documented, evidence-based conclusions on Syria. We cannot accept efforts to put unsubstantiated claims on the same level as the authoritative, impartial, and evidence-based findings of the OPCW. To do so would undermine the integrity of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Mr. Chair, Syria has clear legal obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. Over the years, it has evaded its responsibilities and failed to cooperate meaningfully to meet those obligations. Its initial declaration of chemical weapons stockpiles is a web of gaps and inconsistency and remains incomplete. This is what we should be discussing today. Tragically, we've seen the documented, repeated use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government on its own people. The OPCW and the UN has now provided 8 reports with factual, evidence-based, and impartial conclusions attributing the uses to the Syrian authorities. The most recent of these, released earlier this week, shows that chlorine was used by the Syrian Air Force on Sarakib on the 4th February 2018. Those who use chemical weapons must be held accountable. There can be no impunity for such a breach of international law. For our part, we're fully committed to fully implementing the EU sanctions regime, which has imposed restrictive measures on persons and entities involved in the development and use of chemical weapons. Mr. Chair, the bottom line remains the same. Syria must do what it promised to do, what it is legally obliged to do: declare and destroy all of its chemical weapons stocks and facilities. Last July, the OPCW Executive Council set out the clear actions that Syria must take to ensure compliance with the CWC. Syria chose not to act on these, and we again urge Syria to act immediately to comply with this decision. Ireland has co-sponsored the decision put to the Conference of State Parties, CSP, to the Chemical Weapons Convention for its meeting next week. In the absence of the necessary action by the Syrian authorities to meet their obligations, we believe that the CSP must take all appropriate action to address Syria's non-compliance. Thank you, Chair.
I thank you for your statement, and I recognize Ambassador of Estonia. Sven, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Vasily. I have first the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries Turkey, the Republic of North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania, as well as Georgia, align themselves with this statement. Russia has called for this informal meeting in the Security Council to discuss how to uphold the chemical weapons non-proliferation regime. The timing is right, because the second part of the 25th Conference of State Parties of the OPCW is under preparation. But the narrative is not. The discussion should not be about defending states that come under investigation of the OPCW, but about protecting people against attacks with chemical weapons and about holding those responsible for the attacks accountable. It should be about defending a key instrument of the global non-proliferation and disarmament architecture, the Chemical Weapons Convention. It is one of the most successful global disarmament regimes. It has ensured the destruction of more than 98% of the world's declared stockpile of chemical weapons. The near universal respect for this convention has spared the world enormous human suffering. The reports from the OPCW Investigation and Identification Team, IIT, on the use of chemical weapons in Syria from 8th of April 2020 and 12th of April 2021 are stark reminders of the realities when the CWC is not respected. On 24th, 25th, and 30th of March 2017, sarin and chlorine were used against civilians in Ultamena in Syria. On 4th of February 2018, chlorine was used in an attack against civilians in Sarakib in Syria. In both instances, the OPCW Investigation and Identification Team concluded that the Syrian regime was responsible for the use of chemical weapons. The European Union reiterates that any use of chemical weapons anywhere at any time by anyone under any circumstances is unacceptable. We are deeply concerned to see the continued use of chemical weapons in Syria, Malaysia, UK, and most recently in Russia against Alexei Navalny. Those responsible for the use of chemical weapons must be held accountable, always. And this meeting should focus on the message and not attack the messenger. The OPCW and its technical secretariat have played an indispensable role in ensuring the effective implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and the European Union acknowledges the OPCW's professionalism, impartiality, and independence. We have full confidence in its capacity to implement the decisions and tasks given by the states parties, and we reiterate our firm support. The role of the OPCW is closely linked and complementary to the work of the UN, as underlined in the UN Security Council Resolution 2118 from 2013 and the UNGA Resolution 75/265 from 2021, and it has the clear backing of the UN member states. We appreciate the willingness of the Director General of the OPCW, Fernando Arias, to deliver comprehensive briefings to this council when he is called upon. This has ensured transparency and openness on the work of the OPCW and reinforced the link between the two organizations. In more than 90 meetings in this council, we have been reminded of Syria's failure to live up to its fundamental responsibilities under the CWC, the gaps and inconsistencies in its initial declarations and the undeclared facilities. This is characteristic of Syria's lack of cooperation with the OPCW since the adoption of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2118 more than 7 years ago. Syria's refusal to faithfully deliver the requested information cannot and must not remain unanswered. It is now up to the international community to take appropriate action. The CWC is clear. In these circumstances, Article 12 of the Convention stipulates that the Conference of State Parties may suspend the rights and privileges of the state party concerned as recommended by the OPCW Executive Council. That is the most important decision to be adopted at the 25th Conference of State Parties of the OPCW on 20th to 22nd of April. Mr. Chair, accountability is essential to prevent re-emergence of chemical weapons. The use of chemical weapons by anyone, be it a state or a non-state actor, anywhere, at any time, and under any circumstances, is a violation of international law and can amount to the most serious crimes of international concern, war crimes and crimes against humanity. We remain steadfast in defending the organization against disinformation and deliberate and baseless attacks on its integrity and credibility. The European Union and its member states will continue to work on national and international levels to address chemical weapons attacks and other atrocity crimes committed by the Syrian Arab Republic. Finally, I would like to add and stress in my national capacity as a representative of Estonia just how unacceptable are Russia's systematic attacks and disinformation campaign against the OPCW. Today's meeting is yet another example of such action, and it does beg a question whether the undermining campaign serves to draw attention away from one's own actions. I reiterate Estonia's full support to the OPCW Technical Secretariat and its investigative mechanisms that have provided consistent and solid evidence on the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime against its own people. I also remind to certain members of this council of our collective obligation to act and respond decisively in the face of clear evidence of the use of chemical weapons. The task of the Security Council is to prevent the use of weapons of mass destruction. But despite numerous attempts, the Council has remained blocked due to absolute lack of political will by one of its permanent members. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank representative of Estonia. The purpose of Arria Formula meetings is to provide additional information on topics that we are discussing. And it is not a repetition of our regular Security Council meetings on chemical file of Syria. I thought, and I would encourage colleagues to use the presence today of our guest speakers, of our briefers, to engage in dialogue with them, because today we are not stressing on Russia's concerns. Russia has concerns, and quite legitimate, but it's not only Russia that has concerns over that file, and to ignore it is not the way to resolve the situation. And on disinformation campaign, I simply would like to remind you once again this photo. Just look at it. And now I know that we have the representative of France back in the room, and I'd like to give the floor to him now, or to her.
Thank you,
Nicolas.
President. I would like to say straight away that I regret that Russia and China has called us here today for a new disinformation exercise. France welcomes the publication of the second report of the OPCW's investigation and identification team. This new report is damning. It concludes that units of the regime's air force used chemical weapons in Sarakeb on 4th February 2018. It follows the report released on April 8, 2020, which concluded that bombs containing sarin and chlorine were dropped in Latamne, Syria in March 2017. I say it strongly, the use of these weapons by the Syrian regime is unacceptable and cannot go unpunished. France is fully mobilized. On behalf of 46 state parties to the Chemical Weapons Conventions, we have submitted a draft decision entitled Countering the Possession and Use of Chemical Weapons by the Syrian Arab Republic, which will be submitted to the second part of the 25th Conference of State Parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention, which will be convened next week in The Hague. I say this with gravity. It is time for the Syrian regime to be held accountable, and I call on all state parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention to support this draft decision. Mr. Chair, we have heard a good number of lies today. It is disturbing that so many efforts are being made to confuse, to protect a guilty regime, and to paralyze international action. These accusations that seek to discredit the OPCW with pseudo-scientific expertise are just absurd. They do not convince anyone, and above all, they are irresponsible. Instead of preserving the integrity of the Chemical Weapon Convention, these accusations contribute to undermining it. This near universal convention is meant to enforce the ban and to work toward a world free of chemical weapons. This is a pillar of our collective security, and we cannot tolerate such attempts to undermine it. The IIT report was written with great professionalism, independence, and a robust and transparent methodology. There is no conspiracy. There is no pressure. There is no instrumentalization of OPCW. There is just and simply the cold reality of the facts. We all know these facts. The Syrian regime has used weapons of war banned for almost a century by international law against its own people. And since then, these atrocious weapons have reappeared in Syria and elsewhere. Mr. President, there cannot be impunity for these crimes. Those responsible must be held accountable and punished. This is why France launched in 2018 the International Partnership Against Impunity for the Use of Chemical Weapons, which today brings together 40 states and the European Union. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of France. I cannot miss reminding you one thing, that during that meeting that I referred to a few times already today, the foreign minister of France of that time, Dominique de Villepin, said that the report presented to the Security Council by the United States Secretary of State Colin Powell contained information, indications, and questions that deserve to be explored further, but it would be up to the inspectors to assess the facts in accordance with the resolution 4041. Already, the report brought a new justification to the path chosen by the United Nations, which should strengthen the international community's common resolve on the disarmament of Iran. You want to respond, please?
Mr. President, thank you for this very nice reminder. You're just speaking to the former advisor of Foreign Minister de Villepin in 2003. So I was part of this decision. I contributed to this speech, and I would not cut one piece of this position in 2003. And I think France and others were right in those days. What I just said on Syria chemical weapons, I don't change anything neither, because I think this file is becoming a shame.
Thank you, Nicolas. I'm proud that I know you, that we are friends. And now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Ambassador. First, referring to the concept note for this meeting, let me make it clear that Norway rejects several of its premises. Norway has full confidence in the technical expertise, objectivity, impartiality, and independence of the OPCW, including its Director General and Technical Secretariat. This is something we reiterate every month in the Council meetings on Syria chemical weapons. This meeting is called to discuss upholding the integrity of international non-proliferation regimes, but it's clear that the true focus is on the treatment of Syria at the OPCW. This should be considered against the backdrop of the OPCW's investigation and in the identification team, IIT, report, which finds reasonable grounds to believe that the Syrian Air Force was responsible for the use of chemical weapons. With the latest report, the IIT and the OPCW UN Joint Investigative Mechanism have now attributed a total of 8 cases of the use of chemical weapons to Syrian authorities, all of which have taken place after the adoption of Resolution 2118 regarding the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons and after Syria's ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention. At the same time, Syria has yet to resolve 19 of 22 issues from its initial declaration. If anything, such a blatant lack of adherence to obligations arising from the Chemical Weapons Convention is what constitutes a challenge to the integrity of the Convention as an international non-proliferation regime. We are invited by the hosts of this meeting to present our view on how to uphold the chemical weapon non-proliferation regime and the authority of the OPCW. For Norway, the answer to this question is simple. Any attempt to undermine the international norm against the use of chemical weapons is dangerous to us all and must be rejected. States parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention, including Syria, must adhere to its provisions. Attempts to discredit or bring into disrepute the OPCW and the work of the Technical Secretariat must stop. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway. Now I give the floor to the representative of Vietnam. Basti, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by thanking our briefers today for sharing their views. Chair, international law has been playing a vital role in fostering friendly relations among nations, including through the adherence to and implementation of their treaty obligations. As a committed advocate of multilateralism and international law, Vietnam would like to reaffirm its consistent policy of supporting non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction with a view to their general and complete disarmament. That's why we value the theme of upholding the integrity of international non-proliferation regime. In the current context, I would like to share the following points. First, further efforts should be aimed at full and comprehensive implementation of treaty obligations on non-proliferation and disarmament of weapons of mass destruction. Only by doing that, the ultimate goal of freeing the world of WMDs and the risk of their use can truly be achieved. At the same time, the right of states to use nuclear, chemical, and biological technologies for peaceful purposes must be upheld and should be facilitated. Second, national implementation of treaty is primary. However, it can only be truly effective and efficient if complemented by international cooperation, including capacity building and technical assistance among states and between states and treaty bodies and international organizations. Such cooperation is much encouraged and should be based on fundamental principles of international law, mutual respect and constructiveness without politicization or double standards. As regards the chemical weapon issue relating to Syria, we believe that engagement between the OPCW Technical Secretariat and the Syrian authorities should be constant. We call on the two sides to intensify their dialogue and cooperation to address the remaining issue. We note that the OPCW reports have recently indicated further certain activities achieved through technical cooperation between the two sides. Third, like states, international organization treaty bodies must abide by international law and respective treaties. Their work must be carried out in an objective and impartial manner. Investigation of alleged violation must follow strictly guidelines and higher standards in order to obtain irrefutable evidences and establish facts. 4, as international organizations at global level are to address issues worldwide, their officers and staff should possess the highest technical and moral standards, as well as knowledge of global and regional particularities. We therefore have been strongly advocating for better representation of people from developing countries in the various positions and staff in international organizations. Mr. Chair, to conclude, the goal of ridding the world of WMD is noble. It requires equally lofty commitments and efforts. It can only be achieved together, collectively. The unity of the international community is a must. Vietnam will continue to join efforts in this regard. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Vietnam, and now I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation's reservations with respect to the Arria Formula format of meetings are well known. We do not wish to see this platform being misused to target any particular member state. We have listened very carefully to the remarks and presentations made by the non-proliferation experts and rapporteurs invited today. India is an unstinting supporter of global non-proliferation efforts. We continue to advocate that state parties to international conventions and treaties should fully implement their obligations under such instruments in order to maintain and promote international peace and security. We have seen both the first report and now the second report of the IIT on incidents in Syria. India has consistently underlined the need for impartial, credible, and objective investigation into any use of chemical weapons, following scrupulously the provisions of the Chemical Weapons Convention, the procedures embedded within it, and in conformity with the delicate balance of power and responsibility enshrined under it. And to finally, to establish the facts and to reach evidence-based conclusions. The current report falls short of these expectations. The concept note shared for this meeting mentions inter alia about Iraq as well as in the context of weapons of mass destruction. We need to draw appropriate lessons from such instances to find a credible way to addressing this issue. We also wish to underline that member states must strictly adhere to commitments under international conventions and treaties, including the Chemical Weapons Convention. The international bodies tasked with upholding international conventions must remain mindful that perception of bias or subjectivity in the discharge of their duties impacts adversely on the credibility of the international disarmament and non-proliferation architecture. It also dents international cooperation among member states, especially the developing countries. We take note of the cooperation extended by the Syrian authorities to the OPCW Secretariat. We encourage Syria to continue engagement and cooperation with the OPCW mechanism to resolve all pending issues expeditiously. India has provided a financial contribution of $1 million to OPCW Trust Fund for activities relating to the destruction of chemical stockpiles and related facilities in Syria. India remains concerned about the possibility of weapons of mass destruction falling into the hands of terrorist entities and individuals. It is deeply concerning that the involvement of external actors in Syria has given a fillip to the growth of terrorism in Syria and in the region. We are concerned at the frequent reports of the resurgence of groups like ISIS in the region. We cannot afford to dilute the fight against these terrorist groups. India remains willing and open to discussions with state parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention to find ways and means to strengthen the convention and its effective implementation, as well as to foster candid and open discussions on the way forward. Lastly, let me reiterate a call for a comprehensive and peaceful resolution of the Syrian conflict through a Syrian-led dialogue, taking into account the legitimate aspirations of the people of Syria, facilitated by the UN in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of India, and now I give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank the Russian Federation and China for co-organizing this meeting. And let me begin by reiterating Tunisia's steadfast commitment to the disarmament and non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction architecture. We would also like to restate our strongest condemnation of the use of chemical weapons anywhere, under any pretext, by anyone, be it a state or non-state actor. Those responsible must be held accountable. Mr. Chair, upholding the authority of the OPCW entails strict adherence to the letter and spirit of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which created the organization. The CWC is indeed a comprehensive and well-balanced treaty with strong safeguards capable of addressing and resolving issues related to chemical disarmament and non-proliferation in a multilateral, cooperative, and rules-based manner. We accordingly deeply regret that consensus has eroded at both the OPCW and the Security Council on this matter. We continue to follow the ongoing we continue to follow the ongoing process at the OPCW policy-making organs related to the question of compliance of Syria with its chemical obligation under the CWC and Resolution 2180. The work of the OPCW and its member states should be given every opportunity to continue with full observance of the CWC provisions. It is also essential that all allegations of chemical weapons used in Syria undergo thorough, impartial, and transparent investigations in order to identify those responsible for such use, including non-state actors. Mr. Chair, we would like to take this opportunity to underline again the critical importance of establishing as soon as possible a zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. We recall in this context that the decision to establish such a zone was and still is an integral part of the deal for the indefinite extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1995. The United Nations conference aiming at elaborating a legally binding treaty establishing a zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, which held its first session in 2018, represents a positive step toward this goal and deserves full support. We encourage all concerned parties to participate constructively in the forthcoming sessions of this conference. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of Tunisia. Now I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First of all, we thank Russia and China for convening this Arria Formula meeting and the briefers for their presentations. Multilateralism depends on strong institutions and confidence in their technical expertise as the basis for sound fact-based discussions and decisions. This is valid whether we address issues related to climate change, human rights, or upholding the non-proliferation and disarmament regime, among others. Concerning the latter, Mexico has trusted and defended the technical assessment provided by the verification teams of institutions such as the IAEA. History has proven us right. In the same vein, we strongly support the impartial, independent, and professional work of the OPCW and the mechanisms that the CWC states have established regarding the use of chemical weapons. We have also traditionally advocated for providing the BWC for strong verification mechanisms. Whenever there are doubts or concerns about non-compliance with obligations and commitments in existing treaties, they can only be solved through openness, transparency, and continuous engagement. Mr. Chair, in this regard, we reiterate our call to the Security Council to change the dynamics of the discussion on these issues, suspending the exchange of accusations and automatic disqualifications in favor of fact-based dialogue and collaboration with international organizations. Finally, let me reiterate that non-proliferation and disarmament are two mutually reinforcing processes which deserve equal attention. It is Mexico's conviction that all weapons of mass destruction must be prohibited and eliminated, and we condemn any use of these instruments of war by any actor under any circumstances. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Mexico and now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
I thank you, Chair. Kenya thanks the permanent missions of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China for convening this Arria Formula meeting. The United Nations was founded as a multilateral mechanism to save the world from another scourge of war that had brought sorrow to humankind. It is through this multilateral approach that the community of nations has developed treaties and agreements of the global disarmament and non-proliferation regime, without which the world today would be a much more dangerous place. One of the landmark disarmament instruments is the Chemical Weapons Convention, which bans the use of chemical weapons and prohibits all development, production, acquisition, stockpiling, or transfer of such weapons. As a state party to this convention, Kenya condemns any use of chemical weapons wherever and by whoever convinced that such atrocities constitute a deplorable violation of international law and cannot be justified under any circumstance whatsoever. Kenya reaffirms its support for the mandate of the OPCW and its responsibility as the technical body overseeing the implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Kenya views the OPCW as a technical and not a political organization that should rely on consensus in order to arrive at its decisions. Indeed, Kenya believes that though the process of consensus building can be drawn out, painstaking, and laborious, it ultimately allows state parties to own, accept, and implement decisions arrived thereof. We therefore encourage all state parties and stakeholders to the Chemical Weapons Conventions to continue seeking methods of work that strive for consensus and that remain aligned with the standards set out by the convention. This will also ensure that there is no politicization, no polarization of the OPCW. The success of the multilateral framework for non-proliferation and disarmament is contingent on the individual and collective adherence by all member states. Kenya therefore encourages all state parties to comply with the obligations under international non-proliferation regimes as an essential element to the maintenance of international peace and security. In conclusion, I reiterate Kenya's belief that the multilateral framework for non-proliferation and disarmament will work best if all countries participate in it, underpinned by mutual respect and equality. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya. I understand that UK is not yet in the room, so I'll wait to give them the floor when Jonathan appears on the screen. And now I give the floor to the representative, to the permanent representative of Germany. Christoph, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Vasily, for having a chance to speak today. Also, as a non-member of the Security Council, and let me say to start with that I align myself with what has been said by the Ambassador of Estonia, by Sven, for the members of the European Union, and also what has been said by my European colleagues who spoke before me. I would like to take a bit of broader approach and actually do, Vasily, what you asked for in your previous intervention, and actually take up what the briefer said. And I want to start and pick up what Larry Wilkerson said about the topic protecting of nations against political pressure. Larry Wilkerson clearly said that the US, among others, is exercising political pressure. He gave the example of the ICC. And there I appreciate that the new administration has now come back and is no longer fighting the ICC, and would be good if Russia and China would also join and take a cooperative position there. But Larry Wilkerson also quoted you, Russia and your co-sponsor China, as being countries that actually exercise political pressure. And I must say that in this respect, Vasily, Russia there is a master of exercising political pressure. We've just been seeing this this week with Russian troops that are massing on the border of Ukraine, or earlier this week in the Security Council, I heard that Russia tried to prevent Kosovo demonstrating and showing its flag, and that despite of the fact that the International Court of Justice ruled already that the declaration of independence of Kosovo was in conformity with international law. So bullying OPCW. This is the third time we have an area where Russia is trying to undermine the credibility and the professionality of the OPCW. Russia is rebuked every time. It's rebuked also in the OPCW in The Hague, but by staging these events over and over again, I think our Russian friends believe that something in the end will stick. And if it doesn't help, then you take other measures. And as I did before, let me remind colleagues of the Russian attack, actually a physical attack by hackers in the center of The Hague, where they were red-handed caught in April 2013 when they launched a cyber attack on OPCW. So the topic today is the upholding of the integrity of international non-proliferation regimes. And Vasily, at the beginning, you held up a iconic photo, as you described it, the Secretary Powell. I have another iconic document here to show, and that is actually a letter that has been sent by Sergei Lavrov, as he was in 1994 the ambassador of Russia to the United Nations, where he asked the Security Council to have as a Security Council document one of the most important documents of non-proliferation, and that was the famous Budapest Memorandum, where in 1994 Ukraine said that we are getting rid of the nuclear weapons, and in exchange Russia guaranteed the territorial sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine. We all know what happened. The same Sergei Lavrov was very proud on this achievement for the non-proliferation regimes. The same Sergei Lavrov, who was foreign minister now, is defending day and night the aggressive stand towards Ukraine and actually the violation of the Budapest Memorandum by the invasion of Russia of Ukraine. But continuing on the non-proliferation regime and the protection of the non-proliferation regime and the chemical weapons regime, when you read the note, you have the impression that Russia really has the intention to protect the regime. But at the same time, we have to go back to the facts, and we have to go back to the fact that it's Russia that is made responsible for the deaths of Alexander Litvinenko, who uncovered Russian corruption and was killed by the use of polonium. Or Russia also made responsible, as you know, by the poisoning by Novichok, chemical weapon of Sergei Skripal, and poisoning of him and his daughter. And the latest, and this is, I think, a high point of Russian cynicism, is the poisoning of the leader of the Russian opposition, Alexander Navalny, by Novichok. Again, when you listen to the Russian narrative there, it was either Navalny himself who poisoned, or it was Germany that poisoned. And now, instead of pursuing the perpetrators, Navalny is put into a prison and held in absolute brutal circumstances. So I could continue this list of violation of international law, from the undermining of this Libya sanctions regime by deploying militias, the Wagner group in Libya, by the same group accused of war crimes in Syria, of Russia's undercutting of international humanitarian law in Syria by depriving the civilians of humanitarian aid, etc. But let me conclude here, just say, as others have said before, Assad is waging and has been waging a war against his own citizens. Russia does not exert the pressure that it could on Syria to stop that, to really come to a political solution which we need. And again, there is no doubt, and Russia signed the and also agreed to the resolution 2118 that Assad has used chemical weapons, and also it is clear that Syria is not in compliance with 2118, and therefore the Chemical Weapons Convention is very clear in its Article 12 that a member state, Syria, that is, may be suspended its rights and privilege because of this. So we should go back and really do what the UN stands for. Let's use and apply the strengths of the rule of law and not apply bullying and the law of the strongest. Again, thanks very much, Vasily, for allowing me to participate in today's meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, Christophe. I'm telling my colleagues in the council, quite sincerely, by the way, that I'm missing you. I'm missing you here. Look, but the problem is that you are too predictable. I've been hearing that from you, what you said in your statement every time you take the floor in similar circumstances. And I will spare my colleagues in engaging in a dialogue with you. We have it both bilaterally, and the issues for the dialogue are not the issues that we're discussing today. And I told you that I'm always prepared to discuss all those issues that you raised and to give you our perspective. And thank you for the expose that you are making every time you speak. You said we are bullying the council. Look, if revealing the truth is bullying, yes, we will continue bullying the council. We want to expose the truth, and we want to show that there are legitimate concerns that you prefer to simply to ignore. And that's been a long time. And now we came to a point where you will make a decision that will further deteriorate the situation. So if you call that bullying, yes, that is bullying. Now I'd like to give the floor to Australia.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thanks, colleagues. I'm delivering this statement on behalf of Canada, New Zealand, and my own country, Australia. Our countries remain deeply concerned by the use of chemical weapons in Syria. The use of chemical warfare agents or toxic chemicals as weapons anywhere, by anyone, and under any circumstances is prohibited, reprehensible, and cannot be tolerated. We have said previously, and we say again, that Syria must be held accountable for its illegal actions in using chemical weapons. And the OPCW is an appropriate, impartial, and effective forum to address Syria's proven chemical weapons use. It is deeply concerning that some here today seek to legitimise Syria's use of chemical weapons by discrediting the OPCW and its work. The organisation's investigation and identification team has performed a critical role in impartially investigating and assessing chemical weapons use in Syria under very challenging circumstances. Its findings regarding the Syrian Arab Air Force's use of sarin and chlorine in attacks in 2017 and 2018 are supported by robust evidence and sound analysis. We have heard claims today that Syria's use of chemical weapons has been fabricated and that the OPCW's methodologies have been flawed. We hear charges that the OPCW's findings are unsubstantiated and politically motivated, aimed at undermining the sovereignty of a developing nation. These claims are not based in fact. They are deliberate disinformation aimed at muddying the waters and sowing confusion ahead of the conference of the states parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention to be held next week in The Hague. The facts are those established by the IIT and the OPCW's other investigative mechanisms, the fact-finding mission and declaration assessment team, as well as the OPCW-UN joint investigative mechanism. Each of these efforts has credibly revealed Syria's chemical weapons program. Our countries fully support the integrity of the OPCW Technical Secretariat and its investigative teams. It is important to set the record straight on Russia's claims that these teams acted in blatant violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. The IIT was established in full compliance with that convention. It is false to say otherwise. Likewise, the draft decision for the 2021 Conference of the State Parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention has full legitimacy. The issue has been considered by the Executive Council in accordance with the proper process established by Articles 8 and 12 of the Convention. The Executive Council recommended action to the Conference of the States Parties, which is duly acting on that recommendation. Again, all in accordance with due and correct process. To say otherwise is blatant trickery. We know that the OPCW commands the strong support of the international community, with the exception of just a tiny group of countries. We must defend the organisation and its work against this latest in a series of efforts to discredit and undermine it. Today's meeting is part of an ongoing disinformation campaign aimed at seeding confusion and doubt about the OPCW's mandate and expertise. This is bad for multilateralism. It is bad for peace and security, especially in Syria. We must support the OPCW and stand strong against impunity for chemical weapons use. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand reiterate our strongest support for the OPCW. Its impartial, independent, and utterly professional investigative work is essential to holding the perpetrators of chemical weapons use in Syria to account. We stand by the highly professional work of the OPCW's investigative teams. We defend the IIT's legitimacy and credibility as an evidence-based, independent body. The fight against chemical weapons demands that we support and champion the OPCW's objectivity, impartiality, and integrity. Thank you, Ambassador.
I thank the representative of Australia, and now I give the floor to the representative of Netherlands.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Chair. Let me start off with fully aligning ourselves with the statement delivered by the EU earlier, and these remarks are in our national capacity. Mr. Chair, all state parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention agreed that the use of chemical weapons is unacceptable. Syria violates this agreement. Syria does not comply with the Chemical Weapons Convention. This cannot pass unchallenged, just like some of the unfounded claims expressed by briefers today. For almost 8 years, Syria has had every opportunity to fulfill its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention, as well as under Security Council Resolution 2118. The Declaration Assessment Team of the OPCW visited Syria numerous times. The Director General held dozens of consultations with Syrian officials. Member states of the OPCW time and again demanded that Syria would be fully transparent about its chemical weapons program. Instead, Syria chose to hold back parts of its stockpiles of chemical weapons and to not give up its production facilities. In spite of mounting evidence that Syria had not been fully transparent and had not completely given up its chemical weapons program, it persevered in lying about the use and possession of chemical weapons. The evidence against Syria is absolute and irrefutable. Not only has the investigation and identification team of the OPCW concluded twice already that there are reasonable grounds to believe that Syria is responsible for attacks with chemical weapons, also the joint investigative mechanism set up and mandated by the Security Council established Syria's responsibility in 4 separate attacks with chemical weapons before it ceased to exist due to a veto of the Russian Federation in the Council. We must not be fooled by the continuing unfounded attempts to discredit the Technical Secretariat of the OPCW. The Director General and his staff are working to the best of their ability in an impartial, objective, and professional manner, and they have our full trust and support. Mr. Chair, to conclude, the use of chemical weapons can never be justified. Those responsible must be held to account. Justice must be done. The Netherlands urges the CWC member states to show dedication to uphold the universal norm against the use of chemical weapons and take appropriate action at the Conference of State Parties in The Hague next week. For the victims, for Syria, and for the rest of the international community, it is critical that all of these violations cease and that impunity finally ends. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of the Netherlands, and now I give the floor to the representative of Venezuela.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the outset, allow me to thank the delegations of the Russian Federation and China for co-organizing this informal meeting to address such a critical matter as is the pressing need to uphold the integrity of international non-proliferation regimes, especially in the current international juncture, when we are witnessing with concern a growing resort to unilateralism as the preferred means of certain governments to exert pressure on others and profit both politically and economically. Our appreciation also goes to today's briefers for their much valuable presentations. Mr. Chair, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, as the responsible member of the international community it is, has always complied with and adhered to its international commitments and obligations, including those derived from the Chemical Weapons Convention to which it is a signatory. As a matter of fact, our country does not possess, produce, or stockpile chemical weapons and categorically condemns in the strongest possible terms their use anywhere by anyone and under any circumstances. Venezuela firmly believes that the OPCW is an intergovernmental organization of an exclusive technical nature that has the mission of implementing the provisions of the CWC as part of global efforts to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons and the threat of their use. It is precisely because of this noble mission, which is underpinned by a technical mandate to oversee the permanent and verifiable elimination of these weapons, that we cannot allow that these organizations and its activities be politicized, and instead, we must redouble our efforts for preserving the way in which it was originally conceived. Mr. Chair, as we have said in the past, Venezuela considers that the decision entitled Addressing the Threat from Chemical Weapons Use, adopted in the 4th special session of the Conference of States Parties to the CWC, and the establishment of the investigation and identification team exceeds the limits of the field of disarmament, and it could lead to a dangerous situation in which the mandate of an international organization can be broadly interpreted without prejudice to the prerogatives that are exclusive to the UN Security Council. Needless to say, it is rather regretful the manner in which this decision was adopted without consensus, which goes against the well-established practice for adopting decisions within that organization by consensus, a practice that must be preserved and which ultimately undermines the effective implementation of any decision, while setting a dangerous precedent for the way in which the OPCW operates. Mr. Chair, the international community needs an OPCW capable of effectively promoting and verifying adherence to the Chemical Weapons Convention. We therefore need to abandon the current path of politicization, which threatens to compromise the legitimacy, integrity, and reputation of the organization. We need to avoid going towards this road into which some state parties want to drive us, which only serve the selfish national interests of a few. Proceeding in a different manner will only make us accomplices to the destruction of the OPCW, which is already going through a serious crisis of credibility as a result of the questionable conclusions of the IET, which have been weaponized by these very same countries that are attempting to destroy the organization in their systematic attacks against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of the Syrian Arab Republic. We firmly reject such an approach, which has been deliberately used as a means to exert pressure on the Syrian government, despite its cooperation on the subject, and including on the basis of the latest report presented by the IIT, which is full of scientific shortcomings, irregularities, and is a clear example of the selective and biased approach of this group of investigators and analysts whose intentions, professionalism, objectivity, independence, and impartiality is today into great question. Let us be clear. Today, these attempts we are seeing are aimed at exerting pressure and weaponizing the OPCW against Syria. But tomorrow, this could be the very same case for any other nation. We cannot allow for such a brutal practice to be institutionalized, where a few governments believe they have the power to falsely, baselessly, and arbitrarily accuse other independent and sovereign states of an alleged non-compliance with international non-proliferation regimes for the sake of advancing their so-called regime-change policies in blatant violation of the UN Charter. By the way, we seize this opportunity to actually indicate that we concur with the ambassador of Estonia in his remarks, that this is not about defending particular states. Let us add, though, that this informal meeting, as we understand it from the concept note received, is instead about promoting a frank discussion aimed at decisively ensuring that the confidence on the OPCW and the integrity of the CWC is preserved and upheld without politicization of any kind, and to avoid that they be misused or rather instrumentalized for exerting political pressure on developing countries. To conclude, Venezuela seizes this opportunity to demand once again the full compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention and the respect to the norms of international law and obligations under international non-proliferation regimes in order to restore the credibility of the OPCW and realize the fulfillment of its missions, while duly taking into account the concerns expressed by many of its states parties, including through a necessary, comprehensive, and meaningful dialogue among them, guided by adherence to the principles of sovereign equality of all states and non-interference in their internal affairs. The upcoming conference of states parties to the CWC next week in The Hague provides a privileged opportunity for this, and we make vows for the OPCW and its technical secretariat not to miss it. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the representative of Venezuela, and now I give the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Russia and China for organizing today's meeting and the experts for their presentations. Mr. President, Kazakhstan has initially and consistently been against the politicization of the OPCW's activities and considers it unacceptable to endow the OPCW with an attributive mechanism, and also supports the preservation of the United Nations Security Council's exclusive right to determine the perpetrators of chemical incidents and their punishment. Kazakhstan considers the platform for interaction between the OPCW member states as a key element in strengthening the global regime for the non-proliferation of chemical weapons. And the current case with Syria, on the contrary, may create a negative precedent for politicizing the issue and putting collective pressure on certain unwanted countries in the future on the margins of this purely technical organization. Once again, we reiterate the need to maintain unity in the organization. We strongly believe that the new functions of the OPCW and the possibilities of expanding its mandate should be considered and implemented with the participation and support of all CWC participating states. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan, and now I give the floor to the representative of Belarus.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank the Russian Federation and China for convening this meeting, and I also thank all panelists for their insightful presentations. International agreements to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, are a core of the global non-proliferation and disarmament architecture. Disarmament and non-proliferation agreements have always been regarded as cooperative tools aimed at decreasing the risks of military confrontation and also at promoting trust, peace, and security. Some of these instruments and international fora are now being abused and exploited for political pressure and coercion under the pretext of non-proliferation concerns. The Republic of Belarus has always respected the authority of the OPCW as the primary international body to lead multilateral and, most importantly, concerted cooperative efforts aimed at prohibition and destruction of chemical weapons. Unfortunately, the course of action since 2018 clearly demonstrates that this intergovernmental institution has departed from trying to achieve its main goal and is now being used by certain countries to serve their political agenda. Examples abound. Highly controversial report of the OPCW fact-finding mission on Duma incident of April 7th, 2018 questioned even by the organization's own inspectors. The decision on the so-called our attribution mechanism, the establishment of the investigation and identification team that goes far beyond the mandate and authority of the OPCW. All these actions and all these moves not only severely damage the reputation of the OPCW and undermine its credibility for the world community. False allegations of the alleged use of weapons of mass destruction, as we all know, were used in the past to start military intervention and aggression against sovereign independent states. We all remember vividly, many of us remember vividly, a glass tube presented at the UN Security Council with allegedly biological weapons. Putting forward the draft decision aimed at suspending Syria's rights in the OPCW at the upcoming session of the Conference of State Parties of the Chemical Weapons Convention is yet another vivid example of political pressure and efforts to politicize the organization, and also a clear indication of trying to justify potential military activities. All this contradicts the spirit of dialogue and cooperation. We fully support the idea that this decision could only deepen divisions in the organization and in the UN Security Council. It can produce devastating effect on international cooperation on non-proliferation of chemicals. If materialized, this move could become an extremely dangerous precedent that will then be eagerly used against any other country. We call upon the resumption of a mutually respectful dialogue among state parties to the CWC, because this is the only way to restore impartiality and to preserve the integrity of both the convention and the organization for the benefit of the global non-proliferation regime and of the entire international community. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ambassador of Belarus, and I'm being informed that Ambassador Jonathan Allen of UK is back with us. Jonathan, if you are prepared to speak. I don't see you on the screen. Are you ready?
Vasily, I'm here, if I have the floor.
Take the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, in the early hours of the 21st of August 2013, the Syrian regime targeted Syrian citizens in 3 suburbs of Damascus with rockets containing the nerve agent sarin. Around 1,500 people died, many were women and children. Following these attacks, the Security Council came together unanimously to adopt Resolution 2118 of 2013. In that resolution, the Security Council called on Syria to cooperate fully with the OPCW and the United Nations and to expeditiously eliminate its chemical weapons program. Syria's initial chemical weapons declaration, upon which the 2014 destruction of its chemical weapons stock depended, was inaccurate and incomplete. For years now, the regime has failed to account to the OPCW Declaration Assessment Team outstanding issues in its declaration. Its claims have been implausible and insincere. The regime has claimed, for example, that 15 tons of the missing sarin precursor DF had been used in tests, and another missing 5 tons had been lost in accidents. When the evidence of Syria's retention of chemical weapons proved too compelling, the regime changed its stories. Many times it changed its story. It has now amended its original declaration 17 times. We now know, by the Syrian regime's own testimony, that at least 1 chemical weapons production facility, 4 laboratories, 5 types of chemical warfare agent, hundreds of tons of chemicals, and thousands of munitions were omitted from its initial declaration. This was not mere carelessness or forgetfulness. As subsequent investigations have shown, This retained chemical weapons capability went on to be used by Syria in attacks against the Syrian people. Most of these attacks have involved the use of chlorine dropped onto civilian centers from helicopters, in particular by a division of the Syrian armed forces known as the Tiger Forces, under the control of Brigadier General Suhail al-Hassan. These are the same Tiger Forces that have recently been found responsible by the OPCW Investigation and Identification Team for the chlorine attack on Sarakib in February 2018. For this and other chemical attacks, the chain of command and ultimate responsibility almost certainly lies with President Assad. But the Assad regime has not limited its continued use of chemical weapons to chlorine. On the 4th of April 2017, 20 months after the supposed destruction of Syria's chemical weapons stocks, at 6:50 in the morning, a Syrian Su-22 aircraft delivered an aerial bomb filled with sarin into the center of Khan Sheikhoun. This attack killed at least 90 civilians, 30 of them children. As the OPCW's IIT reported in April 2020, the attack in Khan Sheikhoun was preceded by 2 sarin attacks carried out by the Syrian Arab Air Force in Latamina on the 24th and 30th of March in 2017. The chemical profile of the sarin used in all of these attacks bears the unique signature of the sarin declared by Syria. This is all a matter of record, established by detailed and thorough investigations of the OPCW. In each of its investigations, the OPCW has clearly set out its mandate, the standard of proof that it applies, the nature and substance of the evidence that it has considered, the analysis that it has conducted, the independent experts that it has consulted, the various scenarios that it has considered, and the evidential reasons for discounting any of them. Where states parties have queried reports, the OPCW has responded in detail. The OPCW has now found Syria responsible for multiple chemical weapons attacks and other serious failures to meet its obligations as a state party. But the truth is that today's meeting is not about the evidence. It's got nothing to do with protecting developing countries or upholding the non-proliferation regime. The truth is that today's meeting is the latest manifestation of a systematic disinformation campaign designed to shield the Assad regime and its backers from accountability for its use of chemical weapons, whatever the cost to the international non-proliferation regime. We've heard much about the OPCW fact-finding mission's investigation in Duma. Russia has tried to call into question the integrity of the OPCW, to undermine the international consensus against the use of chemical weapons, and to challenge the nature of objective truth. It has accused humanitarian organizations responsible for collecting evidence of being terrorists. It has carried out clumsy cyber attacks against the OPCW, and it has attempted to intimidate its members. It is deeply regrettable that a permanent member of the Security Council should go to such lengths in an attempt to undermine the international consensus against the use of chemical weapons. Regrettable, but sadly not surprising. It is not surprising because during the same period that the Assad regime was using chemical weapons against its own people, Russia was doing the same, targeting Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in the United Kingdom in 2018, and Alexei Navalny in Russia in 2020. Now, colleagues, simply put, the truth is exactly what it looks like. A state that had an extensive chemical weapons program, that it failed to declare properly, that retained weapons that it sought to hide, but was found on multiple occasions to have used by competent investigating authorities. And responsible states parties are taking appropriate action. Last year, responding to the first IIT report, the Executive Council set out clear steps for Syria to take to come into compliance with its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. Syria failed to respond. This week, the IIT issued its second report. And next week, the Conference of States Parties will consider how to address Syria's repeated use of chemical weapons and its continuing failure to account fully for its chemical weapons. The decision tabled by France is proportionate and reasonable, and we urge all states parties to support it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of UK. Now I give the floor to the representative of Cuba.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon to all our colleagues. Thank you so much to the host for convening this meeting, and also thanks to the panelists for their briefings. We reiterate our commitment to the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and its full, effective, and non-discriminatory implementation. We strongly reject the use of chemical weapons by any actor and under any circumstances. Cuba does not possess nor does it intend to possess chemical weapons, and insists on the need to guarantee the destruction of the stockpiles declared by the United States, the only possessor state party, in accordance with the provisions of the conventions, its verification annex, and the relevant decisions adopted by member states. We reject the selected, non-transparent, and politically motivated approaches on the implementation of the conventions, and emphasize the need to avoid the politicization of the work of the OPCW and the allegations of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. It must be preserved the technical mandate of the OPCW and the consensus-making practice. We recognize the unprecedented efforts by which the Syrian Arab Republic acceded to the convention, as well as the cooperation offered by his government to the technical secretariat of the OPCW in the difficult conditions faced by this country since its accession. Research on the alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria must be conducted based on objectivity, impartiality, and transparency. We oppose to any unilateral action outside the UN Security Council in clear violation of international law and the UN Charter. Thank you all our colleagues, and have a good day.
I thank the representative of Cuba. Now I give the floor to the representative of Nicaragua.
My delegation would like to thank Russia and China for organizing this important meeting, and also the panelists for their insightful presentations. We fully agree with the concept note that has been previously shared with us. We oppose the politicization of the non-proliferation regimes established by the international community. We are concerned that since the last time we met under this same theme and in this same format, this trend has intensified, especially with regard to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, endangering the institutionality and credibility of the OPCW, as evidenced by the selective approach and discriminatory manner in which the accusation of chemical weapons used in Syria have been formulated against a member state of this organization. We recognize the enormous political will demonstrated by Syria in acceding to this convention and complying with its rules of procedures under extremely complex conditions. My country, as a chemical weapon-free state party, is committed to the full, effective, and non-discriminatory implementation of this convention. However, we are concerned about these dangerous precedents and the lack of transparency, so we have repeatedly called for the need to preserve the technical mandate of this organization and for any investigation to be conducted on the basis of objectivity, impartiality, and transparency, especially respecting the decision-making mechanism and the consensus. We consider it is important to take into account the recommendations made by the independent experts and inspectors at this meeting. The case that has been exemplified today shows the danger of unilateralism, acting outside of the United Nations Security Council in clear violation of international law and the UN Charter. We cannot allow ourselves to be dragged by the interest of certain countries. We need to preserve the professionalism of this and any convention. Any decision must be adopted and legitimized by the members of this convention on the prohibition of development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons and their destruction, by consensus, according to its rules of procedure established and agreed by all. Thank you, Ambassador.
I thank the representative of Nicaragua, and I would like to give the floor now to Ambassador Wanchi of Iran. Please, Ambassador.
Mr. Chairman, I thank Russia and China for organizing this
meeting and express my thanks to the distinguished panelists for their inputs. Weapons of mass destruction are indeed the most immoral and inhumane weapons ever developed by mankind, and their development, production, stockpiling, and use have rightly been prohibited. The only absolute guarantee against the use of these inhumane weapons is in fact their total elimination, and to ensure that they will never be developed. This noble objective clearly proves the inherent value of non-proliferation and disarmament regimes and their essential role in maintaining international peace and security. Nevertheless, the authority of such regimes and the credibility of relevant international institutions have seriously been challenged and undermined in the past decades, ironically, in most cases, not by those seeking to develop WMDs, but by those who have abused non-proliferation regimes to advance their own interests. The Security Council was dead silent when chemical weapons provided by the West were used by Saddam in his aggression against Iran, killing thousands of Iranian and Iraqi citizens. It was the case when Iraq was invaded by Western countries based on completely false WMD-related claims. The Council is again silent when Syria has been under extreme pressure in recent years because certain powers are abusing the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to advance their illegitimate interests in that country. Likewise, Iran was placed under unprecedented UN sanctions until 2016, only because of an unnecessary crisis manufactured by certain Western powers under the so-called proliferation concerns over our peaceful nuclear program. However, the Israeli regime, which has developed all types of weapons of mass destruction and has refused to join international treaties, banning these deadly weapons is not held accountable by the Security Council because it is shielded by the United States. The authority of non-proliferation regimes and the credibility of related organizations cannot be preserved and upheld automatically and in isolation, while disregarding these bitter realities. The only absolute guarantee to that end is the strict application of non-proliferation norms to all, at all times, and under all circumstances, and above all, without exploitation of the norms or politicization of or discrimination in their application, as well as the impartiality and professional work of the relevant multilateral machineries. We must therefore resist the politicization and abuse of non-proliferation norms and related institutions, renounce flawed methodologies, fake and unreliable evidence, or disregarding the chain of custody in relevant investigations, and reject biased and politicized conclusions and reporting by relevant mechanisms. The draft decision on Syria submitted to the 25th Conference of the State Parties to the CWC contains all such elements, thus should be rejected. As a major victim in contemporary history of the most systematic use of chemical weapons, Iran once again condemns in the strongest possible terms the use of chemical weapons by anyone, anywhere, and under any circumstances. We also strongly reject all efforts undermining the CWC's authority and OPCW's credibility and call for the balanced, full, and non-discriminatory implementation of the CWC and upholding the authority of the OPCW. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think, Ambassador Veran, that concludes the list of those delegations that wanted to take the floor, and I'd like to give the floor back to the briefers. And first, I'd like to give the floor to Colonel Wilkerson. Colonel, you have the floor.
Thank you. And let me say, first of all, that as a military professional, I welcome all the powerful, strong statements from each of the states against chemical weapons and against their use, their stockpiling, against their very existence. Warm words to this military professional's heart. Second, I thought, I've not been in, no experience with this Arria Formula process, but I thought that it was conducted or set up so that we could do things on a little bit less usual, shall I say, basis. But what I've heard here today is everything but a discussion of the Duma incident and the OPCW's performance with regard to that incident. What I've heard is everything from Sergei Lavrov's promise to Ukraine to a tour de force or a tour de horribilis, if you will, of Syria's atrocious or alleged atrocious actions over the past few years. And it has nothing to do really with the integrity of the OPCW, which to me seems at least has a high possibility of being very much undermined with regard to the Duma incident, April 18th. So that's the one thing I see about this discussion that was a little bit disconcerting, is that we're not looking at that one particular incident where there is evidence that its integrity was undermined. One incident of undermining the OPCW or the IAEA or any other international organization's professionalism and conduct of its mission is bad. And should be looked at and should be investigated, and the appropriate people should be reprimanded, held to accountability or whatever. I know that's not something we do in the international community very often. If we did, my president, George W. Bush, would be up on war crimes. Torture, clearly, a war crime. Maybe even the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a war crime. Certainly, Kofi Annan made statements that it was. But I'm looking at the Duma incident, and I'm looking at the particulars of that incident, and I'm looking at what looks to me like a very convoluted process that produced a good report and then produced a report that was more politically influenced than it was a report on the facts. So that's just the comment I have after listening to all of your conversations, which I enjoyed. And as I said, and I will repeat, I particularly enjoyed. My heart is throbbing from the fact that you all condemned chemical weapons and that you all seem to be sincere in that regard, regardless of your political disposition. And that's great. That's a wonderful thing. And I think the OPCW needs to be supported in all of its integrity with regard to policing that. Thank you.
I thank you, Colonel. I particularly enjoyed your candidate's openness and frankness, and the way you presented these things, like a real military should. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Aaron Mate.
Thank you. I want to echo what Colonel Wilkerson said there about there was a lot of discussion today, but very little discussion about the key issue here, which is Duma. And the Ambassador Allen from the UK said that all this has nothing to do with the evidence. He's correct insofar as he's talking about his government's position. There is convincing evidence here of fraud. No one has challenged it. I laid out some of it for you. It's been written about in articles, in statements sent to the OPCW. And Ambassador Allen and the other delegations did not challenge a single fact, while simultaneously claiming that it's us who are trying to undermine the credibility of the OPCW by raising these issues. No, we're actually trying to protect the OPCW from political influence. And the only way to do that is to assure the integrity of the investigation. And there is just a fact that you have dissenters from inside the OPCW, not from any other country, not on social media, people who worked at the OPCW raising concerns about this investigation, people who actually went to Syria for this investigation. It's them who are raising the concerns here, and it's them who are trying to protect the integrity of their own investigation. Now, we should add too, it's not just these two dissenting inspectors that we know about. Hans von Sponeck broke some news today when he said that the Berlin Group statement that was delivered to the OPCW was returned to sender. The OPCW would not even accept it. Well, who signed that statement along with Colonel Wilkerson and Hans von Sponeck? The first Director General of the OPCW, Jose Bustani, and 5 other former OPCW officials. Are these former OPCW officials the victims of a state disinformation campaign? Are they trying to undermine their own organization? No, they're trying to protect it. And the only way to protect it is to listen to the inspectors. Now, there was some comment made about Sarakib, this new report. I don't want to get too much into it because I think the fact is that unless you address the Duma question, where scientific fraud is documented, then that raises automatic questions about anything else, including Sarakib, the investigation there. But let's look at Sarakib. If you read the report, it says that it's based on the information that was received from the original OPCW fact-finding mission team that investigated Sarikib. And that initial OPCW fact-finding mission in Sarikib states that they received all samples from one group. That group is called the White Helmets. Who are the White Helmets? They're an organization funded by some of the belligerents in the Syria war. The US and the UK, which were involved in a war supporting insurgents inside Syria, also funded the White Helmets. The White Helmets also have been working openly with Al-Qaeda linked groups. There's videos of them taking part in executions, and they were critical to putting out video of a hospital scene in Duma that doctors at the hospital scene essentially said was staged, because they said the victims there were not treated for a chemical attack, but for smoke inhalation. So according to this Sarikib report, all samples that they received were obtained from the White Helmets, a compromised organization to say the least. Now, what's funny about this is that this violates the OPCW's own stated policies. And I want to share with you a quote from Michael Lujan, who was a former OPCW spokesperson, speaking back in 2013. This is what he says: the OPCW would never get involved in testing samples that our own inspectors don't gather in the field, because we need to maintain chain of custody of samples from the field to the lab to ensure their integrity. That is the OPCW spokesperson in 2013. So according to the OPCW's own spokesperson and own policies, the chain of custody in Sarikib was violated, which raises another issue to at least be skeptical of it, along with the unaddressed fraud in the Duma investigation. So on that point, I want to ask a direct question to the ambassador from the US, Ambassador Mills, and Ambassador Allen of the UK. There is a proposal now from Hans von Sponek that he said before for this matter, the Duma fraud, to be taken up by the OPCW's Scientific Advisory Board, its own Scientific Advisory Board, not Russia's China Advisory Board or China's, the OPCW's own Scientific Advisory Board. The proposal is for that board to look at the Duma evidence and to meet with the inspectors on the original team. Will you support that proposal? And if you don't, please explain why. I'd love to hear an answer to that today. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mate. And now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. von Sponek. I think you are off air, Mr. von Sponek. Please switch on your mic.
Forgive me. I just want to say a few things about the interim report in relationship to what the representatives of UN member states have said. If you take the before and after version of the interim report, and you have in front of you clearest evidence of manipulation of an assessment made by credible scientists, as a normal individual who doesn't have to protect his or her government, I must tell you, I felt frightened, because the evidence was so clear. I ask all of us, all of you, with respect, why can you not look at the material that Mr. Mate has put so well before us and look at that? If you think, please allow me to be open, if you think that it is simply defending the political interests of some particularly P5 members, you're mistaken. I don't come from that direction. All I want, and I think that's something where I will have and have a lot of support from the street, if you want, from the normal citizens around, is that the Security Council and the state parties take the courage and the time to look at material that is there to discover that we are not ill-led, manipulated individuals that are defending the political interests of some member states. This is rubbish. Forgive my strong language, but I'm very upset about that. The Arria Formula meeting that I have attended during the last 3 hours reminds me of the same approach, even though there was no Arria Formula in 2000, of what we heard coming out of the United Nations in New York about Iraq and the evilness of that regime. We did not defend Saddam Hussein. Neither do we defend today in what we have said and stated the current president of Damascus, of Syria. 2 more things. Do you really believe that 28 individuals that decided with some courage, it's not easy, ambassadors, to swim against the stream, but they decided to swim against the stream because they wanted what did they want? They wanted truth. They wanted facts. Of course, we have heard many voices this afternoon or this morning of governments rightly stressing the need to protect the organization. I think there's a consensus about that. Everyone wants to protect the integrity of a multilateral organization that is so important as OPCW. But then give yourselves and the others a chance by doing what we have put before this meeting, where we have suggested that in a very non-ideological manner, but in the spirit of how a multilateral organization should function, then let your delegations that are talking in The Hague talk about the Director General to get the team together. Everybody, everyone, whoever had anything to do in the fact-finding missions with Duma, and it was about Duma. And if I have one disappointment about today's meeting, it is the fact that many delegations that spoke out totally missed the point. They talked about something they have said over and over again, but they didn't address. Was it lack of courage, or was it simply because you refuse to accept the fact that something went wrong? In saying something went wrong, nobody is saying on our side that we are defending Damascus. We are defending the truth and the integrity of OPCW, and I hope very much that you can come to that same conclusion by encouraging Dr. Arias to meet with everyone and come out with a revised report, not on any weapons misuse in Syria, but strictly and totally dealing with Duma. And then we are relieved. Who are we? We are normal people. We are not forced by anyone to talk and defend a position that is of interest to a particular government. Forgive me, I've spoken in not a very eloquent way, but this is what I wanted to say. And I wanted to thank the ambassador of Russia and the ambassador of China for having taken this initiative that I'm sure was not very much favored by many whose voices we have heard this morning. Thank you.
I thank you, Mr. von Sponik. I'd like to give the floor now for a brief comment by our Syrian colleague, Ambassador. You have the floor.
Thank you, Vasily, for giving me the floor again. First, I would like to comment on the U.S. representative intervention. The U.S. representative started his intervention by saying that his country controlled the oxygen that member states can have. This reflects the hegemonic mindset which my country, Syria, has been suffering from for years. He accused Syria many times of using chemical weapons, which we categorically rejected. On the other hand, we did not hear from him one single word about terrorist group using these chemical weapons. He said that 46 states parties co-sponsored the draft decision submitted to the second part of the Conference of States Parties. However, the truth is that 41 of these countries are Europeans and Westerns. which means that only 5 countries out of the rest of the world supporting their initiative. Only 5. This clearly shows that this draft decision is a Western-led action against Syria, which should be rejected by the rest of the world. On another note, what was said today about the flaws in the Duma incident report applies to OPCW's report on another alleged incidents in Syria that took place before or after Duma, including Sarakib, Latamna, or Khan Sheikhun. The reason is that OPCW teams follow the same wrongful methods of work. It's applied on the same way. Finally, regarding of what the French ambassador said, I would like to remind him also that in 2003, Syria was a non-permanent member of the Security Council and shared with France and Germany, among other countries, similar positions opposing the American-British campaign which led to the invasion of Iraq, using the ploy of possessing WMDs, the ploy of possessing WMD. It is surprising that France and Germany became a part of the American campaign against Syria under the same pretext. Once again, I would like to thank Russia and China for organizing this important meeting and the briefers for their valuable information and analysis. Thank you, Vasily.
I thank you, Bassam. I think it's time to wrap up and allow me to do so. Today we had a lot of criticism towards the way OPCW handled Duma investigation. We also heard accusations of Russia in particular in trying to wage a disinformation campaign about that those episodes and about the Syrian chemical file. What is interesting, but not surprising in fact, which was noted by our briefers, that none of the Western countries that spoke, none of them either disproved or challenged what the briefers were saying today. They were not talking to the briefers, and they were not trying to deal with the facts or with their opinion that they present. But in fact, Duma and Khan Sheikhun are only the tip of the iceberg. There are many more other episodes which have been scrutinized by international independent experts, and there are many questions that should be dealt with, first and foremost by the OPCW Director General Fernando Arias, whom we, of course, would be most happy to see in the Security Council again soon. I want to reiterate that Russia is absolutely on the same page with everybody who appealed today for ensuring that chemical weapons are never used again in Syria or elsewhere. As we see, all the briefers and our Syrian colleagues are also committed to this goal. We are also in favor of ensuring accountability for any chemical weapons use. But there is a big difference between ensuring accountability and trying to punish an independent state on the basis of questionable, to put it mildly, pieces of evidence collected through biased third parties and with obvious breach of OPCW chain of custody. This fully applies to the latest product of the illegal IAT on Sarakib that was mentioned repeatedly today. And Sarakib report came not accidentally, it came coincidentally. It came in advance. We said in advance that it will emerge on the eve of the upcoming conference of state parties in The Hague next week. No surprise that it bears the same errors, original sins as previous investigations, and cannot, under any circumstances, be considered fair and technically correct and convincing. Colleagues, I want to ask you once again to reflect on what are the promoters of the draft decision of state parties depriving Syria of its rights up to? What do they really try to achieve? Do they want to strengthen cooperation between Syria and OPCW? Obviously not. We can't see any logic behind such plans, especially given the fact that Syria actively engages with the OPCW, as is confirmed by recent Secretary General's report. Nevertheless, we have learned that our Western colleagues spare no effort to try to tip the scale in their favor in The Hague at any price, obviously at the expense of truth. In particular, we have learned that France and Denmark are organizing on April 19, on the eve of the OPCW Conference of State Parties, a presentation of an ill-famed movie Cave, which has been repeatedly rejected by professionals as a propaganda stunt. We hope that the delegations in The Hague will not succumb to such blatant pressure and manipulation aimed at winning their support for the French draft decision that I mentioned. In order to shed some additional light on this propagandistic endeavor, we invite you to join the webinar hosted by the Russian Embassy in The Hague, also on April 19 at 16:30, immediately preceding the French draft event. And I also noticed that Mr. Mate addressed directly, personally, to Ambassador Mills and to Ambassador Allen. Since they are not here, I promise, I commit that we will ask that question that you posed, Mr. Mate.
I'm sorry, they have left the meeting, so they can't answer my question?
They are not at the meeting personally. So since that was a personal question, we will address that question to them personally, to their delegations, and we will ask them to provide their answer on it. Colleagues,
they're not here.
Sorry, yes. Colleagues, I would like to thank you once again for participating in this event. I hope that we will not stop at this by trying to really expose and reveal what is happening around the Syrian chemical file, which is a big enigma mystery that we have been seeing unrolling for the past 8 years now. Yes. 8 years. Thank you very much. I particularly thank the briefers for their time and for their very valuable contribution. Thank you and goodbye.